Thanks very much. Thank you. So I have a few minutes to try and convince some of you here to go and read the work of a gentleman whose photograph, do we have a photo of wonderful Wendell? There he is. Wendell Berry. Has anyone read Wendell? Yeah, you definitely the people at the back. So this is Wendell. I don't know, I'm not a big person for selfies at all. I found myself slightly cringing, but we were in the middle of Kentucky and no one was around. So I think I will definitely be the only person in Wendell's life who's asked him for a selfie and actually took it. So I just want to very briefly tell you about Wendell and why I love him so much. And it started with my interest in farming and processes of farming. And a kind of sense, I'm a journalist, and a sense that I needed to bring things together more with understanding farming at a global level, but also within Ireland. And obviously in Ireland, we produce so much food for everyone else. So much of what we do isn't about local, and trying to get a sense and an understanding of that. And it led me to this man, who's Sir Albert Howard, who was born in 1873, and he was a government scientist in India. And he went there and started to look at what they were doing, and then wrote a book, this book, and another very seminal book about the soil. And he's seen as the godfather in many ways, or the father of the organic movement, but he's a lot more than that. His ideas and his whole philosophy really can be summed up by the sense that he said that the processes in agriculture and food production have to be analogous to those that we see in nature. This is a very, very technical book, but on the back of Ted's amazing talk there, I just wanted to very, very briefly read you one little paragraph, which relates to Ireland. This really is about how you do it, how do you produce food in accordance with the rules and the limits of nature. He said, a young Irishman aged 23 with a physical and alertness of mind and body, it was a delight to behold, was found to be suffering from very bad jaundice after 2 months of living in England, where he'd been living on a diet mostly of bacon, white bread, meat sandwiches and tea with a little meat and an occasional egg. In Ireland, his food had consisted of the fresh natural products of the soil, potatoes, porridge, milk and milk products, broth made from vegetables, and occasional meat, eggs and fish. The changeover to a diet of white bread and sophisticated food was at once followed by disease. This case shows how quickly good health can be lost by improper feeding. So kind of interesting in terms of what your body is used to ingesting and how your health responds to that. Anyway, Albert Howard brought me to Wendell. Wendell is one of his biggest fans, and in many ways, everything that Wendell has written about stems from is sort of an extension, actually, of what Albert Howard has written about. The whole problem of health in the soil, plant, animal, and man is one great subject. You cannot divide them. So who is Wendell Berry, for those who don't know? He is a very big thinker. He's an academic by training. He was born in Kentucky, and he then went back after, teaching in New York and big universities. He went back to Port Royal in Kentucky, very, very rural area, and bought a farm with his lovely wife in 1964 and tried to rehabilitate the farm. It had been very badly hit by mining. He wrote this particularly seminal book called The Unsettling of America. I think it's safe to say there's absolutely nothing that I've ever read or heard about local food movements around the world that don't relate to everything that Wendell was saying back in the 60s and 70s. The Unsettling of America was written in 1977. And if you read it now, it's more relevant now than it was back then. He then also wrote this book, which, Michael Pollan is his greatest fan, Bringing It to the Table, which sort of links how we use the land with food production. Briefly, I'm going to read two things before I read them. This is Wendell. I went to Wendell's farm last August. I got a call from a message from Sheila Dillon, who is the amazing presenter of the food program on BBC Radio 4. She knew I loved Wendell. She said, would you like to go and do a program on him? And I said, oh, Sheila, you'd be so much better at it than I would, hoping that she'd disagree. And luckily she disagreed. And so I went and I drove from rural New York, where I was living, down to Kentucky. And all the way I listened to old bluegrass music. And then I arrived and I found Wendell's farm. He wrote a book called A Long-Legged House. And you probably can't see that, but his house, that's his house. A long-legged house. And he was sitting in the porch when I arrived with his two dogs. And he was reading ancient Greek. And he said, "Hello, Miss Ella, I've been waiting for you." And it was just this incredible scene where then I spent a day with him on his farm. He is very against technology. He doesn't believe that technology gives us a sense of limits that we need in order to farm ecologically. And he's a big fan of this Welsh poet called R.S. Thomas, who I also read quite a lot of, who has its own thoughts about work and in praise of human work. So I recorded Wendell reading a very short poem by R.S. Thomas, which we might play now, if we have it.
What to do? Stay green. Never mind the machine, whose fuel is human souls. Live large, man, and dream small.
And so he has a long-running narrative through his work, Wendell, based in many ways on that poem, which is that technology and the benefits of technology actually don't benefit us and don't benefit farmers because it doesn't place sort of necessary limits on us. He took me to his barn where he has these 2 horses, and he had this lovely phrase where he said, biological relationships rhyme ecologically. And what he was trying to say there was that, you know, as long as we connect biologically to each other, then we will not do harm to the land. I think I have a short clip of him talking to me a little bit more about his ideas as to why he thinks this is so important. It's the one of the horses.
Sorry. Well, there's several things to be said in favor of them on a place like this. The first thing to say is that they're safer to use on hillsides, on steep ground, than a tractor. Another thing is they keep the scale right. A limited power, biologically limited. They fit in with the rest of the life of the place. They live from the place. Mostly they make their own living in the summertime by grazing. I give them a little ration of oats when they come to the barn, just to reward them and keep them happy to come. But with horses, there are limits. There's a limit to the amount of ground they can get over. They keep the size of the operation limited. And it's after the acceptance of limits that then you can begin to talk about how things ought to be arranged. There is a fundamental, incorrigible misfit between industrial values and nature's. And to farm properly, you have to begin with the nature of the place. Industrial agriculture doesn't begin with the nature of the place. It begins with the capacities and powers of the technology.
So it's interesting because you hear then the voice of Albert Howard through what he's talking about. And one of the biggest things that Wendell Berry was influenced by is when he went to Italy when he was an academic, and he saw some ancient agriculture. And he realized, actually, we've been doing this for thousands and thousands and thousands of years and haven't been degrading the world in which we are now doing. And how is it that people managed to do it before? I'm going to end, because I know that time is tight, on 2 quick things. One is, when I was in his house, there are animals, symbols of animals everywhere. So, for example, his stove had animals on the side. His doorstop was an animal. Everywhere you could see, he had a kind of reverence for animals and the limits of animals and the limits that animals put on humans. I went out to his farm. He showed me his sheep, and then suddenly this sort of incredible array of monarch butterflies went by, and it was just a sort of a sumptuous experience. 1 paragraph, and then I'm going to leave you with his most famous poem, The Piece of Wild Things, which he sat on a lovely wooden rocking chair, which didn't squeak, thankfully, and I recorded. So I'm going to read this and leave you with that. Here and there on the wooded slopes of the valley, this is him talking, by the way, about where he lives. Here and there on the wooded slopes of the valley are tall open groves of a solemn beauty that keep, as if in a profound interior withheld from the ceaseless drone of engines, a fragment of the great quietness that 2 centuries ago lay upon this valley. The delicate flowers and mosses and ferns and the colourful mushrooms of the woods grow here. The voice of those places is that of the wood thrush, whose notes, without replacing the quiet, flow into it from some hidden perch, and into the hearing of whoever might be there, to attach itself like a clarifying emblem on the memory. In rainy times, the stream steps noisily and brilliantly down the rocky notches. If one can respond to the quiet of those places with quiet, and with enough attention, the woods will reveal its lives. Knowing this valley, only one has started to know it, is clearly no casual matter. Like all country places, it is both complex and reticent. It cannot be understood by passing through. This is Wendell reading his wonderful poem, and I hope in this very brief way I can stimulate any of you to read some of his work. He's a big thinker, he brings things together. You may not agree with everything he says, but it has certainly, in my mind, transformed the way that I view the land and farming and food, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. So this is Wendell reading his beautiful poem, that summer day last August in his farm.
When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free.